Why were the poor of the Victorian era always hungry? The reasons are not at all what you might think. In today's video, I reveal the most extraordinary secrets of that period. What was the Victorian era? This era of paradoxes generated unprecedented wealth and equally unprecedented poverty. The Industrial Revolution created more goods than ever before, but it left those who produced them with empty plates. Hunger was not an accidental misfortune, but a constant companion in life for a vast portion of the population. We are used to thinking of hunger as an absence of food, but in Victorian England, there was food. The shops were bursting with products. The problem was that the poor simply had no money to buy it. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how the world's richest empire created a system where millions of its citizens could not afford even a simple loaf of bread. What if I told you that everything you believed about Victorian prosperity was built on an invisible catastrophe? The image of this era is often painted as a time of opportunity and progress, but for millions, this was a distortion of reality. The fundamental cause of mass hunger began not in the cities, but in the countryside, from which people were forced to flee. This was not a voluntary migration in search of a better life, but a desperate flight from hopelessness. The roots of this problem go back to the previous century, to the agricultural revolution and the so-called enclosure. For centuries, peasants had access to common lands, where they could graze livestock and grow food for themselves. New laws transferred these lands into the private ownership of large landlords, who turned them into more efficient farms that required fewer laborers. Millions of people lost both their land and their livelihood overnight. In parallel, the Industrial Revolution destroyed the cottage industry that had fed rural families for centuries. Previously, women could spin or weave at home, supplementing the farming income. Now, steam-powered looms and factories in Manchester and Leeds produce cloth thousands of times faster and cheaper. Manual labor could no longer compete, and the last source of income in the countryside dried up. Deprived of land and work, these people faced a simple choice: stay and starve, or head to the cities. They chose the cities. London, Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham experienced a demographic explosion, their populations doubling and tripling in mere decades. These migrants were not skilled workers, but desperate refugees in their own land. The cities were completely unprepared for such an influx. There was no proper housing or infrastructure for these new inhabitants. They settled in overcrowded, hastily built slums that sprang up around the factories and docks. These areas instantly became centers of destitution, where thousands of people fought for survival. This sudden and enormous influx of people created what economists call a surplus of labor. For every job at the factory gates or in the docks, a line of dozens of hungry men formed. Employers holding all the power could dictate any terms. They knew that if one worker complained about low pay, 10 others were ready to take his place immediately. Thus, the iron law of wages was formed. Employers paid not what a worker's labor was worth, but the absolute minimum that would physically allow him to come to work the next day. Wages were deliberately set at subsistence level and often even below it. This ensured that the worker would always remain poor and dependent. Do you think this migration was a voluntary choice or an unavoidable trap? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about how much life actually cost in the Victorian era? Let's move away from generalizations and look at the specific numbers that define the lives of millions. Understanding this grim arithmetic is the key to understanding why hunger was the norm. For most unskilled workers, the question was not what to eat, but will I be able to eat at all today? Let's take, for example, one of the most common professions in London, a port loader or docker. These men had no permanent contract or stable salary. They were hired for a few hours or a single day, and this type of employment was called casual labor. Every morning, huge crowds of men would gather at the dock gates, hoping the foreman would pick them. If a man was lucky, he might get a day's work and earn a few shillings. However, luck was not always on his side. He could stand at the gates all day and leave with nothing, meaning his family earned not a single penny that day. At best, a worker could count on 3 or 4 days of employment a week, which made any budget catastrophically unstable. Now let's look at expenses. The main expense was rent. For a single unheated room in an overcrowded tenement in the East End, a family had to pay several shillings a week. This sum often consumed a quarter to a third of the entire weekly earning, if there even was one. After paying for housing, they needed to buy fuel. Coal was vital not only for heating in the damp, cold winters, but also for cooking. Without a fire, one couldn't even boil water. The poor could not afford to buy coal in bulk, so they had to purchase it in very small, but very expensive bags. And now we get to food. After deducting rent and coal, the family was left with mere pennies. This money had to feed several people for a week. The choice of food was dictated not by desire, but exclusively by the price per calorie. And here, nothing could beat bread. A loaf of bread was the cornerstone of the poor's diet. It was relatively cheap, filling, and required no complex preparation. It is estimated that families of unskilled workers spent more than half of their food budget solely on bread. This was not a choice, but a necessity, the only way to fill their stomachs. But what happened if a worker couldn't find even this casual work? The system designed to save them turned out to be more terrifying than poverty itself. In the next chapter, we'll talk about the workhouses. I will reveal the Victorian elite's most guarded secret about fighting poverty. It wasn't charity, but a carefully designed system of social control known as the workhouse. When we think of helping the poor, we imagine soup kitchens or shelters. The Victorian era had its own answer, and this answer was designed to inspire fear. Everything changed with the passage of the New Poor Law in 1834. This law abolished previous forms of local aid and made the workhouse the only salvation for those who could not feed themselves. However, the goal of the law was not so much to help the poor as to cut costs on them and force people to work at any price. To achieve this, one cruel but effective principle was introduced. This principle was called less eligibility, or the principle of less desirability. Its essence was simple. Living conditions inside the workhouse had to be deliberately worse than the living conditions of the poorest, but independent laborer outside. This was a psychological wall meant to deter anyone who could somehow manage to feed themselves. The entire system was built on intimidation. To enter the workhouse meant to lose everything. It was voluntary confinement. The first thing they did upon arrival was take away people's personal clothing and issue them a uniform, erasing all individuality. This was the first step toward dehumanization, transforming a person into a mere inmate. The harshest rule was the immediate separation of families. Husbands were separated from wives, and everyone was separated from their relatives by age. Members of the same family could live under the same roof for years, but they were allowed to see each other at best once a week for a short time, under strict supervision. This rule destroyed the poor man's main support, his family. Work in these institutions was monotonous, grueling, and often pointless. Men might spend hours breaking stones, picking oakum, old tarred ropes, or grinding bones. This work was designed not to produce anything of value, but to break the spirit and make the stay in the workhouse unbearable. The food was strictly regulated and calculated for the absolute minimum for survival. The classic diet consisted of watery oatmeal porridge called gruel, stale bread, and a small amount of cheese or broth. The food was intentionally bland and meager to comply with the principle of less desirability. Therefore, workers would agree to any wage, even the lowest, just to keep their freedom and stay with their families. If you find this information important, please like this video so more people can see it. Are you ready for the shocking truth about what was on a Victorian pauper's plate? Even when a family had enough money to buy food, there was no guarantee that this food was edible. We are entering the dark world of Victorian food adulteration, a systematic deception that turned a simple loaf of bread into a dangerous mixture. In those days, there were virtually no laws for food quality control. The market was wild, and the merchant's main principle was caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. For a poor person buying food in the small shops of the slums, this meant they were completely defenseless against fraud. Anyone could sell anything under the guise of something else. The main target for adulterators was bread. It was the staple food, and it was the easiest to profit from. To make the bread heavier and whiter, bakers used an entire arsenal of additives. The most common of these was alum, a chemical compound of aluminum that bleached low-quality flour. But it didn't stop at alum. To increase the weight of the loaf, ground chalk, plaster of Paris, and even bone meal were shamelessly mixed into the dough. A poor person buying a pound of bread might end up with significantly less flour and therefore fewer calories. He was paying for an inedible filler that only deceived the stomach. Even the sweets, which were occasionally bought for special occasions, were dangerous. The bright colors of the candies were achieved using toxic dyes. Green was obtained with copper arsenite, red with mercury sulfide, and yellow with lead chromate. These substances were actual poisons. This constant deception meant that even those who spent money on food still remained in a state of chronic malnutrition. But why was food so expensive that it had to be faked? In the next chapter, we'll learn about the laws that artificially inflated the price of bread. The high price of bread, which forced the poor to starve and bakers to cheat, was no accident. It was not even the result of bad harvests or natural disasters. In large part, this price was a direct consequence of government policy, namely the infamous Corn Laws. These laws became a symbol of the conflict between wealthy landowners and the hungry urban population. The Corn Laws, in effect in Britain during the first half of the 19th century, were essentially a protectionist measure. They imposed high import tariffs on imported grain. Every time cheap grain from Europe or America tried to enter the country, a huge tax was levied on it, making it uncompetitive compared to local grain. The goal of these laws was simple: to protect the profits of British farmers and, more importantly, the aristocratic landowners who rented the land to them. By artificially keeping domestic grain prices high, they guaranteed themselves a stable and high income. For them, it was a matter of preserving their economic and political power. However, for the millions of workers in the growing industrial cities, these laws were a disaster. Their low wages collided with the artificially inflated price of their main foodstuff, bread. Every penny they overpaid for a loaf was a penny taken from their families, which could have gone toward other food, clothing, or housing. This system created an absurd situation. Britain was a maritime power, capable of bringing in grain from all over the world. Ships with cheap grain sat in the ports, but could not unload it because of the prohibitive tariffs. At the same time, just a few miles from the port, in the slums of Manchester or London, people could not afford to buy bread baked from expensive domestic grain. The crisis reached its peak in the 1840s, which went down in history as the Hungry 40s. For several years in a row, Britain itself had poor harvests. Simultaneously, the potato blight, which destroyed the crop in Ireland and led to the Great Famine there, also affected England. The two staple foods of the poor, bread and potatoes, became scarce. Nevertheless, this story clearly shows how political decisions, made in the interest of a narrow elite group, can directly condemn millions of people to chronic malnutrition. What if I show you a time machine and we look at a worker's ordinary day? For many of the Victorian poor, the biggest problem was not so much the low wage, but its complete absence. We have already mentioned casual labor in the docks, but this system of instability permeated the entire economy. A permanent, guaranteed job with a weekly wage was a privilege unavailable to the majority. Many industries were inherently seasonal. Take construction, for example. In the summer months, building sites were booming, and masons, carpenters, and unskilled laborers could count on full employment. They worked long hours and brought home a relatively stable income, which allowed the family a little breathing room and perhaps to save a few pennies. However, with the onset of winter, everything changed. Rain, frost, and short daylight hours brought most construction work to a halt. Thousands of men found themselves out of work for several months. All they could do was wait for spring, surviving on odd jobs and falling into debt with local shopkeepers. The situation was the same in many other fields. Agricultural work was tied to planting and harvesting. The ports grew quiet when storms reduced shipping. Even clothing manufacturing had its high and low seasons, linked to fashion and orders. This constant economic volatility gave the poor no chance to escape poverty. But what exactly did they eat when they did manage to earn money? In the next chapter, we'll examine the meager diet of the Victorian poor. The diet of the Victorian poor was dictated by one single factor: price. It wasn't about taste, nutrition, or variety. It was about how to get the most calories for the least amount of money. This survival strategy shaped a diet that was startlingly monotonous and catastrophically deficient, leading directly to weakness and poor health. As we've already established, the absolute king of the diet was bread. It was eaten for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was cheap, it was available, and it provided a quick feeling of fullness. A family might eat several pounds of bread a day. Often, this was stale bread from the previous day, which was sold at a discount, or low-quality bread made from bad flour. The second pillar of the diet was the potato. After the repeal of the corn laws and the recovery of the harvests, potatoes once again became one of the cheapest sources of calories. They were easy to cook. Most often, they were simply boiled in their skins. Potatoes and bread made up the vast majority of the diet's caloric content, providing energy, but little else. The third indispensable element was tea. Victorian England was obsessed with tea, and the poor were no exception. Of course, they didn't drink expensive varieties, but the cheapest dust and sweepings. Tea was valued not so much for its taste as for its properties. It was hot, which provided warmth in damp, unheated rooms. Furthermore, the caffeine in tea provided a small burst of energy, and very importantly, helped to dull the agonizing feeling of hunger. Sweet tea with a piece of bread was often the only meal of the day. It was drunk black, as milk was too expensive a luxury, with only a little sugar added if they could afford it. Protein was practically absent in this diet. Meat was an absolute luxury. If a family was lucky, they might buy a small piece of bacon or lard once a week. This piece was used not as a main dish, but as a seasoning. It was rendered down to get fat for cooking potatoes or added to a soup for flavor. The hunger of the Victorian poor was caused not only by the price of food, but also by the fact that almost nothing was left of their meager income after paying for other basic needs. A worker's wage was under attack from two sides. He not only needed to eat, but also to live somewhere and to heat his home. These two expenses, rent and fuel, were ruthless competitors for every earned shilling. The mass migration to the cities, which we discussed, created an acute housing crisis. The demand for housing in industrial centers far exceeded the supply. This gave landlords in poor areas incredible power. They could rent out absolutely inhumane conditions at inflated prices, knowing that the tenants had no other choice. The most common type of housing for a poor family was a single room in a tenement in the slums. In this one room, a family of 5, 7, or even 10 people ate, slept, and lived. These rooms were often in basements that flooded or in attics with leaking roofs. The rent for such housing was disproportionately high. An unskilled worker's family might spend up to a third of their weekly income just for the right to live in this damp, overcrowded room. It was impossible to avoid this payment. Immediate eviction onto the street was guaranteed. These buildings were constructed with a single purpose: to cram in as many people as possible. They had no ventilation, and sunlight rarely penetrated the narrow light-well courtyards. Sanitary facilities, if they existed at all, consisted of a single outhouse in the courtyard, shared by dozens of families. Water had to be carried from a common pump, and it was often contaminated. The second vital expense was fuel. In England's damp and cold climate, a fire was necessary for survival. It was needed not only for warmth, but also for cooking food and boiling water, which was the only way to make it safe to drink. The only available fuel was coal. Perhaps the most powerful factor that allowed this system of hunger to exist for decades was not the economy, but ideology. In the Victorian era, there was not just an income gap between the rich and the poor, but a whole philosophical chasm. The attitude of the middle and upper classes toward poverty was the foundation that justified indifference and blocked any serious reforms. For many wealthy Victorians, poverty was not an economic problem, but a moral failing. In a society steeped in the ideas of the Protestant work ethic, wealth was considered a sign of virtue, diligence, and piety. Consequently, poverty was seen as the result of laziness, drunkenness, immorality, and a general inability to plan one's life. This viewpoint absolved society of all responsibility. If a poor man was starving, it was his own choice, the result of his vices. Newspapers and popular pamphlets of the time were full of caricatures of lazy and drunken workers. This created a convenient image that allowed the structural causes of poverty to be ignored. This ideology was reinforced by popular economic and social theories. The ideas of Thomas Malthus, that population growth would always outstrip food production, were very influential. The conclusion drawn from this was that hunger was a natural and even necessary mechanism for controlling the numbers of the lower classes. Charity, of course, existed, but it was permeated with the same spirit of condemnation. Victorians drew a clear line between the deserving poor and the undeserving. The deserving were considered those who had fallen on hard times through no fault of their own, for example, widows, orphans, or the respectable elderly. They were entitled to modest assistance. The undeserving ones, however, were all able-bodied men and women who could not support themselves. For them, there was only one path, the workhouse, which, as we know, was designed to humiliate and punish. Helping an undeserving poor person with money was considered immoral, as it supposedly encouraged their laziness. For decades, the system that generated hunger seemed unshakable. Low wages, terrible housing, adulterated food, and punitive poor laws created a perfect storm. However, towards the end of the Victorian era, the first timid signs of change began to appear. These changes were brought about not by the kindness of the government, but by the tireless work of journalists, reformers, and the workers themselves. Publicity played a key role in this awakening. In the middle of the century, journalists like Henry Mayhew began to do what no one had done before. They went into the slums. Mayhew, in his series of articles, London Labor and the London Poor, described in detail and with empathy the lives of street vendors, dockers, and beggars. He gave a voice to those who were invisible. These publications, full of shocking facts and personal stories, had the effect of an exploding bomb on polite society. For the first time, the middle class could peer into the abyss that lay just a few streets away from their comfortable homes. The image of the lazy pauper began to give way to the image of a person trapped in desperate circumstances. Later, in the 1880s and 90s, social researchers like Charles Booth took a more scientific approach. Booth conducted a monumental study of life in London, creating his famous poverty maps. He and his team methodically interviewed residents, collecting data on income, occupations, and living conditions. Booth's results were irrefutable. He scientifically proved that the vast majority of the poor, about 30% of London's population, were poor not because of moral failings, but because of economic reasons: low wages, irregular employment, and old age. He showed that poverty was a systemic, not a personal problem. In parallel with this, a political awakening began. The organized labor movement, despite huge resistance, was gaining strength. Trade unions became more influential. The famous Match Girls strike of 1888 and the London Dock strike of 1889 showed that workers could unite and fight for their rights. We see that hunger in the Victorian era was neither an accident nor an inevitability. It was a man-made phenomenon, the logical result of a system built on several pillars. Mass migration to the cities created a surplus of labor, which led to the tyranny of low and irregular wages. Victorian England showed the world how it was possible to be the richest and most industrially advanced country on the planet and simultaneously keep millions of its citizens in a state of constant malnutrition. It was a harsh lesson that economic progress without social justice only creates gilded poverty. What do you think about this dark side of Victorian progress? What other topics from this complex and contradictory period would you like us to cover in future videos? Suggest your ideas in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes.